So welcome back, everybody, for this third and last day. So today we will have the pleasure of listening to Martine and Nida-Rümelin and David Papineau for the last talks. And Martine and Nida-Rümelin is part of our project, so the project on indexicality and consciousness, and she will be our first speaker. She will give a talk entitled "The Argument from Understanding for Property Dualism about Experiential Properties."
Thank you very much. So indeed, I will present an argument against a physicalist account of consciousness, where I understand consciousness in the sense of instantiations of what I call experiential properties. And so to be a dualist about experiential properties is to be a dualist about consciousness. But there will be a bit of preparation before I really come to the argument. And the preparation includes presenting a certain view on what phenomenal concepts are. We have been talking about phenomenal concepts a lot during this conference. And I'm going to present a view about phenomenal concepts that is in contrast with many views that are on the market, so to speak. It's in contrast with, for instance, demonstrative accounts of phenomenal concepts, indexical accounts of phenomenal concepts, quotational account that Kati Barlock still defends, and that David Papineau defended some time ago. And I call it the account of phenomenal concepts as genuine property concepts. So the main part of my talk will be devoted to rendering intelligible this alternative account of what phenomenal concepts are. Oh, I have to get used to the tool that I have to use here. Oops. So a bit more explicitly, here's what I'm going to do. First, I will suggest, as I said, a certain view about the nature of phenomenal concepts. And my claim will be that there are what I call genuine property concepts. I will then motivate the thesis that phenomenal concepts, not all phenomenal concepts, but a certain subclass of phenomenal concepts, give access to the very nature of the properties that they are used to attribute. So I'm assuming that phenomenal concepts are used to attribute properties to other subjects, a specific kind of properties, namely the properties I call experiential properties. And then I will motivate the claim that I call phenomenal essentialism, that some of those concepts are nature revealing, which is it's really the same, I guess, or at least intuitively it's the same that Philip Goff has called transparent concepts. And in the end, by considering the argument that is mentioned in the title, I will explore the consequences quite briefly, but perhaps we have time in the discussion to do more about this, the consequences for physicalism of the thesis that phenomenal concepts are nature revealing. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. So, as I said, I conceive of phenomenal concepts as concepts that are used to attribute experiential properties. So it's helpful if I remind you briefly of what I have in mind when I talk of experiential properties. Julien, in his talk, already introduced that notion. So a property is an experiential property in the very broad sense, if and only if, due to what it takes to have that property, whenever that property is instantiated, there is a subject such that there's something that's like for that subject to have that property on that particular occasion. So I'm using the famous Hegelian locution in order to explain what experiential properties are. Perhaps I should mention that I do not understand this as something like a reductive definition. It's more an explication that is supposed to hint at the commonality of experiential properties that I think each of us can understand based on a variety of different examples. So that's what we have to do, I think, to introduce the notion of experiential properties. Take examples like being sad, seeing a color, consciously think about Paris, and so on and so forth, and then try to understand what they have in common. And a way to hint at their relevant commonality is captured by that definition. Right? Now, I said that according to the view that I want to defend, phenomenal concepts are property concepts. Now, it would be helpful if I had time to say a little more about how I think about property concepts, but I won't have much time to do that, so I will content myself with very few remarks. So perhaps this is something as well that we can do in the discussion. So, trivially, when I talk of property concepts, what I have in mind are concepts that are used for certain purposes when we think. So in our thought, we use property concepts to attribute properties to individuals or to entities more general. So attribute properties is not quite happy because, of course, sometimes we use property concepts in order to consider a hypothesis, in order to speculate whether something has a property, in order to deny, and so on and so forth. But in any case, it involves thinking of something as satisfying a certain condition. And I use attribute properties here in that very, very general sense that should include the other cases, of which I mentioned a few. Now, why do I talk of genuine property concepts? This is to exclude the kind of cases that Paul Boghossian already talked about in his talk at the very beginning of this conference. For instance, we could say this tree outside there has the property that Paul has been thinking about this morning, without having any idea of what property, in a certain sense, we don't have any idea of what property we are attributing. We simply use a certain definite description to pick out the property and then attribute that property to something. That's not a genuine property concept. So I want to exclude those cases when I talk of genuine property concepts. But then the thesis that I would like to defend, namely that phenomenal concepts are genuine property concepts, will become interesting only if one has a certain view about what genuine properties, what characterizes genuine properties, right? And there I will say a few things, and then I hope that the view will become clearer in the concrete application to phenomenal concepts that I will be talking about. Before I say something about how I would like to characterize property concepts, let me give you just a little bit of the background that I have in mind here. So a background conviction that I will not be able to elaborate, unfortunately, can be perhaps expressed in the following manner. The relation between an individual concept and the worldly item picked out by that concept is fundamentally different in nature from the relation between a property concept and the property the concept serves to attribute. So I do think it's unhappy that normally phenomenal concepts are understood as tools of reference to a specific kind of events. And I do think it's unhappy, even if it's not mistaken, but it's misleading to use the term reference across the board for the relation between the concept morning star with Venus and the concept being spherical with the property of being spherical. I think that the relation in those two cases, and also if on the one hand we include natural kind terms like the concept of water and the liquid composed of H2O, and wonder about the relation between these elements, then I think we can realize that the relation in the first case, in the case of names and the associated concepts, and names of natural kinds, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, between the concepts that we have of properties and the properties that we attribute using those concepts are really very different in kind. And so one preliminary description of the difference, although this still doesn't say very much, is perhaps the following. In the first case, so the first case are the concepts associated, if there are, to names and to names of individuals or natural kinds. In the first case, by using the concept in one's thought, one makes some specific object, some specific thing, the object of one's thought. In the second case, by using the concept in one's thought, one thinks of something as fulfilling a certain condition, and one thereby has a certain understanding of that condition in mind. And I think if one really elaborates on this, then one can see that these two relations are very different. But this is certainly something to come back to in the Q&A. Now a little more about genuine property concepts. Here are three conditions that one could use in order to define what a genuine property concept is, but this is still preliminary also. So a concept is a genuine property concept if and only if it fulfills the following conditions. First, it is used in thought to attribute a property. Second, thinking in terms of that concept involves having some substantial understanding of what it is to have the property at issue. And third condition, the concept serves to attribute that particular property that it serves to attribute in contrast to some other property, in virtue of what? In virtue of the way the subject who has the concept understands what it is to have that property. So we may ask, also in cases of reference, we may ask, what is it that makes it the case that the morning star refers to Venus? And then some story about that involves causal relations between the thinker and the thing will certainly be told. And we can ask the parallel question, what makes it the case that a specific property concept attributes that property and not some other property? That's the parallel question. And here, on my view, we have to answer that it's in virtue of the understanding of what it is to have that property that any thinker who has that concept has in mind. So that's to say, if you want to put it if one wants to put it in these terms, that's to say that with respect to property concepts, internalism must be accepted and externalism must be rejected. So what I will do next is to use an example to render intelligible or intuitively accessible the claim that phenomenal concepts are genuine property concepts. But here is now the application first. So what does that mean, that phenomenal concepts are genuine property concepts, based on what I just said? Well, it means that these concepts are used in thought to attribute experiential properties, that thinking in terms of such a concept involves having a substantial understanding of what it is to have the relevant experiential property for someone, what it is for a subject to have the experiential property in mind, so to speak. And third, it involves saying that the phenomenal concept serves to attribute that property rather than the other one in virtue of the way the thinker understands the condition that must be satisfied by someone who has the property. So it's the understanding associated to having the concept that individuates the property that is actually attributed when people use the relevant concept. So that would be the claim. And now the concrete example that I announced. So on my view, it's always really important to have examples in mind when one does philosophy and to test one's intuitions, applying theoretical proposals to concrete examples. And so here's one such example that one can use. I will be talking about Rachel and Paul. So the story is about two people. I imagine them to be syllables that are sitting on the beach one evening at the moment when the sunset occurs, and they are watching the sunset together. And they both observe or look at a specific small cloud that is visible above the horizon, and that has a beautiful color. Now, Rachel is normally sighted, and the cloud looks violet to her. Paul is pseudonormal. Now, what is it to be pseudonormal? Roughly speaking, it's to be red-green inverted. And I take the example of pseudonormality because I find it interesting that many years ago, it was in the 80s, a person working in genetics has really come up with the hypothesis that a certain percentage of male people are red-green inverted due to an inversion of the photopigments in the relevant receptors on their retina. And that person, that scientist, also hypothesized that if this were the case, it would be extremely difficult to find it out. Because people, of course, would learn to talk about their violet experiences in terms of turquoise, and of their turquoise experiences in terms of violet, and so on and so forth. So we are assuming here that, in this example that I would like to use, that neither Paul nor Rachel know of this particular condition. They don't know that Paul is pseudonormal. Perhaps they never even learned about that possibility. And they both believe that they are normally sighted, that they are both normally sighted, and they both believe that they experience roughly the same color. Perhaps they even believe it's exactly the same color, the same color tonality when they are looking at that cloud and when they are exchanging with one another about the beauty of that color. So Rachel believes, using her phenomenal concept of visually experiencing violet, that Paul sees the cloud as violet. And Paul believes, using his phenomenal concept of visually experience turquoise, that Rachel sees the cloud as turquoise. Now, of course, Paul wouldn't express himself in that manner. He would say, Rachel sees the cloud as violet. But the concept that he uses when he has that thought, I think we should accept, is the concept that we, using our language, have to call the concept of seeing something in turquoise. It's not his language. It's the language we use in order to talk about the concept that Paul uses in his thought. Now, of course, they are both wrong about the color experience of the other, right? So Rachel believes that Paul sees the cloud in violet, but that's not true. He sees it turquoise. And Paul believes that Rachel sees it turquoise, but that's not true. She sees it in violet. They are both wrong in that case about the color experience, if you want to say, the phenomenal character or the subjective character of the color experience of the other person. Well, as I just said, Paul would say that Rachel sees the cloud as violet, and yet he would thereby express the belief that Rachel sees the cloud as turquoise. Paul's phenomenal concept involved in his belief about Rachel saves to attribute visually experiencing turquoise. And so now I come back to the purpose I have of presenting this example. We can now ask, in virtue of what? Why is it the case that we must say that Paul, when he uses his concept in that belief, the concept that is involved in that belief, he is really attributing the property of seeing something in violet, in turquoise, sorry, and not in violet. Why are we forced to say this? This is because that is his understanding of what it is to have that property, which is, of course, in that case, formed on the basis of his own experience, right? So here is the result that we, that's how we, I think, should explain why Paul's concept is related to the experience of turquoise and not of violet in the relevant manner. It's so in virtue of Paul's understanding of what it is for a subject to have the experiential property that he attributes via the concept that he uses in his thought about Rachel. Okay. Now, I would like to perhaps try to make this proposal a little more vivid or intuitively clear by contrasting it with the so-called demonstrative account. And I'm not making differences between different versions of the demonstrative account. Now, the demonstrative account, for instance, could be understood as involving, in the case of color, demonstrative reference to qualia, or demonstrative reference to colors, or demonstrative reference to kinds of experiences, or perhaps to token experiences. I don't care about these differences for the moment. Right? I think that what I have to say about what I take to be mistaken in these accounts is the same for all those different versions of the demonstrative account. But roughly, I'm thinking of people like Perry, who has proposed a specific version of the demonstrative account a few years ago. So what I would like to do now is to explain how the GPA, this is the account of phenomenal concepts as genuine property concepts, and the demonstrative account are different. And I would like to explain what is wrong with the demonstrative account from the perspective of the other account, of the account that I'm proposing. And in order to do this, I would like to come back to the old example of Mariana that some people know. And I briefly remind those who know it of the story. And those who don't will certainly understand enough of the example with this based on this brief description. So suppose that Mariana is a person who, until a certain day, let's say May 13th, perhaps 24 at noon, never had any color experience. After that moment, Mariana is allowed to live in a beautifully colored environment. However, she does not see bananas, she doesn't see tomatoes, she doesn't see pictures of landscapes. She is, we may imagine, in a house with a lot of beautifully colored objects, furniture, abstract paintings, and so on and so forth. And there are no mirrors. She cannot look into the mirror in order to see the colors of her own face, for instance. So what that creates is ignorance about which color is called in what way in our language, or in other words, what people were talking about when, for instance, they told her that normally sighted people see the cloudless sky during the day in blue. She has learned this, but she cannot relate it to the experiences that she's now having. And now let's imagine, that's how I originally told the story, that Mariana one evening, and we may imagine that she has already focused a lot on her color experience. She has already done a lot of work in order to develop concepts of these different kinds of color experiences that she now undergoes. And at certain evenings, she is looking at different slides, and she looks at red, pure red, let's suppose. Then she looks at blue, at green, and yellow, and she wonders, which one is blue? And in other words, she also wonders, what is the kind of experience people are having when normally sighted people look at the sky during a cloudless day? That's what she's wondering about. And let us imagine that she finally comes up, for whatever reason, with a true belief, namely with the belief that it's the blue color that people experience. It's the tonality of pure blue, let's say, that people experience when they look at the sky during the day. Okay. Now, the issue is about getting an adequate understanding of Mariana's epistemic progress. And that's where people come apart. And that's where the demonstrative view about phenomenal concepts and the view that I'm proposing to you differ. Let's first have a look at what the demonstrative account tells us about Mariana's progress. So on the demonstrative view, we may say that her epistemic progress consists, in a first step, in the acquisition of new demonstrative concepts. That's exactly as Perry put it in the relevant book. And so no wonder that she can acquire new knowledge, because she has new demonstrative concepts and can now have new beliefs in terms of those demonstrative concepts. And using those new concepts, that's the second element of her epistemic progress, she acquires, in that case, correct demonstrative beliefs in terms of that concept, correct demonstrative belief, which she can express saying, people see the sky during the day. Normally sighted people see it like this. Right? And she is somehow pointing either to the color or to the quadre, or, as Perry is assuming, to a specific kind of experience she is presently undergoing. So here is the alternative. According to the GPA, as I abbreviate that view, one should describe Mariana's epistemic progress quite differently. One should say the following. Mariana has acquired new, genuine property concepts, phenomenal concepts of the various experiential properties that are involved in color vision. In particular, she has acquired the concept of being visually experiencing blue. Via her new concepts, via these property concepts, she has acquired a substantial understanding of what it is to have those properties. So, for instance, via her new concept of visually experiencing blue, she has a substantial understanding of what it is for a subject to have that experiential property. And we have been talking about this in the discussion. One can spell this out, saying that she has the capacity to focus on the particular aspect of the phenomenology of a subject's overall state, which makes it the case, when it's present, that a subject has the property of seeing something in that particular tonality. Right? And that's what people have in common when they have that property. So she has a substantial understanding, I would like to propose, of the commonality of different subjects that share the property of seeing something as blue. And then, of course, she has acquired a new correct belief in terms of that new property concept. Of course, she also acquires demonstrative beliefs, and she also acquires the disposition to form certain demonstrative beliefs. Now, what on the GPA view is the relation between beliefs in terms of those genuine property concepts that are the phenomenal concepts I'm interested in here, and those demonstrative concepts? And here's what I would like to propose. So it's true that while looking at the blue slide, Mariana also entertains the demonstrative belief that people with normal color vision experience that color when they see the cloudless sky during the day. But her relevant new phenomenal belief about the experience of others cannot be identified with that demonstrative belief. Rather, the disposition to form the relevant demonstrative belief is only a manifestation of her new belief about others, which is couched in terms of her new phenomenal concept, together with her understanding of what it is for subjects to have the property she attributes via that concept. So the picture is that we should give priority when we describe the epistemic progress of Mariana to the acquisition of these new property concepts, and then explain why she has the relevant demonstrative belief, saying that she has an understanding of what it is to have an experience of that kind, namely the experience that we, in our terms, even if it's not available to Mariana yet at that point, that we, in our terms have to call the experiential property of seeing something blue. She has developed an understanding of what it is to experience something in that color. And then when she sees something in that color, she of course recognizes that she is now having that experiential property. And that's why she thinks that's the way it's for others, when she has the thought couched in her property concept that others see the sky in that particular manner. Now, I can see that this is a subtle difference between saying phenomenal beliefs are demonstrative beliefs and saying demonstrative beliefs manifest a phenomenal belief together with understanding what it is to have the relevant property. And I think it might become clearer if I present to you an analogy. And the analogy is a crazy story I hope you don't dislike. Science fiction stories. So here is the example I would like to use. So I will tell you something about Cemjana, not Mariana, but Cemjana. And Cem comes from chemistry. And this is because Cemjana, who is an intelligent lizard living on a distant planet in some different galaxy, I suppose, she has the capacity to zoom in. She has a very specific perceptual capacity. So when she has something in front of her, she can do something about the way she looks and zoom into the object so as to see its internal chemical structure. Okay, so she can zoom in on water and sees water as being composed in this particular manner. And she can learn to recognize this. And she can do this on XYZ, Putnam's famous ligate, on twin Earth, and on gold, and so on and so forth. She has this capacity to zoom in and see the internal structure of things. And like Mariana, she is in a particular epistemic situation. She's not allowed to zoom in until a certain day, May 13th again. And afternoon, May 13th, she is allowed to do it, and she discovers with surprise that she can really see into the objects and see their internal structure. And now what does she do? She acquires new concepts. And these concepts are concepts of the structure a thing can have, the internal structure things can have. And perhaps she introduces names for it, as Mariana could have done. I left out this detail. She says structure 1 for the structure of H2O, structure 2 for the structure of XYZ, and so on, so on and so forth. So Cemjana acquires new structure concepts. For instance, the new structure concept, which is about the structure of water. And I think it should be clear that she acquires, that's at least what I want to do with this example, she really acquires genuine property concepts in that manner. By being presented visually, by zooming in with internal structure of objects, she develops an understanding of a certain commonality that things have that are similar with respect to their internal structure. She develops a certain substantial understanding of what things have in common who have structure 1 and things that have in common that have structure 2 and so on and so forth. Now, like in the case of Mariana, of course, there are related demonstrative beliefs. Hasn't reacted. So, for instance, when zooming in on the liquid in a glass of water, I think I left out something that should be on the other slide. She comes to believe something. So this is the analog to Mariana's belief that the sky looks a particular way to normally sighted people. Here we have the belief, which is a belief involving a structure concept, that the liquid in Swiss rivers has structure 1. Right? That's her belief that we are now considering. It's a belief couched in that uses a genuine property concept. Now suppose that she zooms in on a liquid in a glass of water. Someone has given something to drink to her, and in fact it's water. And now she doesn't know what it is. She wants to know what is in the glass. And then she zooms in and she sees, again, a liquid with structure 1. And then she forms the belief, that demonstrative belief, that this is the internal structure of the liquid in Swiss rivers. Now, in this case, in parallel, I would like to say to the Mariana case, the demonstrative belief should be explained by the fact that she has a certain belief couched in a property concept, together with her understanding of what it is to have that property. So Mariana's demonstrative belief, while zooming in on water, that this is the structure of the liquid in Swiss rivers, is a manifestation of her belief, couched in her new structure concept, in virtue of her understanding of what it is to have that structure. And that means that, of course, Mariana's new belief about the internal structure of the liquid in Swiss rivers must not be identified with such demonstrative beliefs. So the claim, of course, is that this is a real analogy, right? That exactly what we should say about Mariana, we should also say about Mariana. Okay? In both cases, the epistemic subject acquires a property concept by being experientially presented with something, visually even presented with something. In Mariana's case, it's the property concept that gives her access to what it is to have certain kinds of experiences, to undergo certain kinds of experiences in the sense of having certain experiential properties. In Mariana's case, it's the internal structure of things, and she learns it on the basis of being perceptually presented with them. But then, as a result, in both cases, we have an epistemic subject that has acquired genuine property concepts, and that, due to having acquired those concepts, has the disposition to form certain demonstrative beliefs. Okay. And if this is so, then it's, of course, a mistake to identify the relevant phenomenal beliefs with demonstrative beliefs. It's to mistake manifestation for identity, so to speak. Okay. Now, so far, I only said that there's some substantial understanding involved in having phenomenal concepts of the property that we attribute via those concepts. Now I would like to say something that is a stronger thesis, but only for specific phenomenal concepts. And that's the thesis of phenomenal essentialism, as I call it. And here's the thesis. Maximally specific, pure phenomenal concepts of pure experiential properties are nature revealing. Now, this contains 3 technical terms that must be explained, which I will do immediately. So I have to explain what it is for a concept to be a maximally specific pure phenomenal concept, what it is for an experiential property to be a pure experiential property, and I should say something about what I mean by nature revealing. So here is the definition of a pure experiential property. We already had the definition of experiential properties in general. Now, pure experiential properties are experiential properties that, in addition, satisfy the conditions A and B that you find there in the definition. The first is that there is some specific way it's like to have the relevant property, such that whenever someone has that property, when that property is instantiated, then there is a subject for whom it is like that specific way to have it. That's not so for all experiential properties. So an example we could take is someone is thinking about Paris, some other person is thinking about Paris. It's not very plausible that there is one specific way it's like for everybody who's thinking about Paris. But it's plausible to think, at least if one believes in cognitive phenomenology, as I do, that conscious thought is phenomenally manifest. So it is an experiential property to think about Paris, in the sense defined. There is a way it's like to think about Paris. But there is no specific way it's like to think about Paris, which is common to everybody who thinks about Paris. And the second condition is that having that property just consists in that specific way it's like to have it. There's nothing more to having that property. It's just that specific way it's like to have it. And here again, there are counter examples. One example one could take is acting. So on my view, and some people share that view, like Terry Horn, I think he would say something like that as well. Acting includes a phenomenally manifest awareness of oneself as the author of what's going on. It includes that one experiences oneself as actively involved. There are some specific phenomenal character to acting. But of course, to act does not consist in there being that specific phenomenal character. Right? In addition, you must do something. Normally you move. Some change must occur that is visible in the physical world. Right? So this would be an example of an experiential property that does not satisfy condition B. So the only experiential properties for which I would like to propose phenomenal essentialism are pure experiential properties in the sense that I just introduced. Now, there is this a little complicated notion of maximally specific pure phenomenal concepts that Julien and I have been working on. For the moment, I think that the following definition is good enough for our purposes. The phenomenal concept C is a maximally specific pure phenomenal concept of the experiential property P if and only if a thinker who uses that concept thinks of the property at issue in terms of a specific way it's like to have it. Furthermore, the thinker who uses that concept takes that property to be a pure experiential property, so to be phenomenally constituted, to be such that to have that property is nothing more than that it's that specific way to have it. And that's the specific way that is mentioned in A. So these are the two conditions by which I would like to introduce it for our present purposes. We have been talking yesterday, sometimes in the discussion, about how one could imagine that someone acquires a maximally specific phenomenal concept. And that could be by focusing on a certain aspect of one's own phenomenology at a certain moment, and then thinking of others as fulfilling the condition that their overall state has a phenomenology with that same aspect, right? And then having the intention, and what I just said already expresses this, to attribute their property, which just consists in having a phenomenology with that aspect, right? And it's maximally specific, because if you make it more specific, if, for instance, you have as an aspect that there is color experience, that you experience a color, and then you go on to talk about a red experience, then you are talking about another property, right? That's in the sense in which it's maximally specific. You cannot make it more specific without talking about another property. Now, what do I mean by nature revealing? Indeed, for the moment, I will not add much to what has already been said about transparent concepts in Philip Goff's sense, where I would like to really restrict the notion of being nature revealing to the case of property concepts, for reasons that we might perhaps talk about later. Now, a concept of a property is nature revealing if and only if the following holds. A thinker who has acquired the concept thereby fully understands what it is for something to have the property. So the idea is that the thinker really has that condition in mind that makes the case that something has that property, and that that condition is fully revealed cognitively to the thinker. There is a problem about how this can be defined and if it can be defined. And if we want to say what it is, to have a full understanding of that condition, then of course we have to talk again of nature revealing properties. This condition must be understood, concept must be understood in terms of nature revealing concepts. Or perhaps one wants to say that there is something non-conceptual going on in the way the condition is given to the epistemic subject. And I think perhaps we should discuss this later on. Now, how could one argue for the claim? That I call phenomenal essentialism. And perhaps before I present that argument, I would like to say something about arguments in general in philosophy. So sometimes arguments, and that's the standard view about what arguments are supposed to do, arguments are presented with the intention to convince the other by showing to the other person, to the one you address, that she or he already accepts certain premises that lead to a conclusion that she didn't see and didn't endorse so far. So it's somehow to rationally force the person you're talking to accept a certain conclusion, given certain premises that the other, on your own view, should not deny. I believe that even if we often talk like this when we talk to others and when we write articles and so on, it's perhaps not the main function that giving arguments has in philosophy. I think that very often giving an argument rather has the function to render the thesis that you want to defend more clear, the content clearer, to render it more intelligible. Seeing the argument, you get a better understanding of what the thesis really is that's being defended. And that, in turn, is very important if one thinks that intuition should play a role in philosophy. And I do think that intuition must play an important role in philosophy. Now, intuition leads us to insights only if we understand very well the thesis that we are talking about. So the argument can be a preparation for testing one's intuitions in a way that is reliable, right? Then the argument really isn't used to convince directly by convincing the other person that there is a consequence of what she already believes. Rather, the argument clarifies the content and is then combined with asking the other to pause a moment and to test her own intuition with respect to the thesis that perhaps became clearer by thinking about the argument. So I tend to think that this kind of argument that I'm giving here is of this type, right? Okay, so here are the two premises. The first premise concerns the nature of pure experiential properties. The second premise, 5 minutes? Okay, that's good. The second premise concerns the access that we have to pure experiential properties via maximally specific pure phenomenal concepts. First premise, the nature of every pure experiential property is exhausted by its contribution to the overall phenomenology of the state of any subject that has that property. Second premise, a thinker who has acquired the pure phenomenal concept of a pure experiential property thereby fully understands what having that property contributes to the phenomenology of a subject's overall state. Therefore, phenomenal essentialism. A thinker who has acquired the maximally specific pure phenomenal concept fully understands the nature of the relevant property. Now, here is something that we have been discussing very briefly, would very briefly like to comment before I come to the final, almost final slide, which contains the argument for property dualism. Here's an objection that we have been discussing yesterday. Someone might say the following: to have in mind the specific contribution of having a given experiential property to the phenomenology of a subject's overall state, so this famous aspect that we have been talking about, does not necessarily involve full understanding of that contribution. That contribution may still have hidden aspects. So this is how I understood Philip Goff's remarks yesterday when he talked about meditation experience, where one may detect that experiencing blue is perhaps more complex than one has thought and has some hidden aspects. That's how I understood it. Perhaps I'm not getting what he said, but I hope I do. Now, a simple example would be this. We would like to say that based on experiencing orange, the subject has acquired or can acquire the phenomenal concept of being visually presented with orange, and then this would be a case where we can apply the thesis. It should give access to what it is to have that property, at least if the subject has the maximally specific pure phenomenal concept of that experiential property. But it could very well be that someone has developed such a concept and yet not realized that visually experience orange involves experiencing a tonality, it should be, a tonality which is at the same time, in a sense, reddish and yellowish. That the person has not recognized the binary nature of the tonality orange. I think that we should reply to this kind of objection in the following way. We should distinguish two things. To fully understand what it is to have an experiential property does not require having complete descriptive knowledge about the essence of that property. So you can have exactly the aspect in mind in the most immediate possible manner, which is responsible for someone having an orange experience, and yet not be capable of describing the essence of orange experiences by applying concepts such as binary hues being composed phenomenally in such and such a manner, and so on. There is no conflict between the two. We should simply distinguish these things. That's my present response that I hope will go through. Now here, the final point that I want to make, which is the anti-physicalist argument. There are 4 premises involved. And I think I can do this quickly because most people are familiar with this kind of reasoning. So the first premise is conceptual independence. Phenomenal concepts of pure experiential properties are conceptually independent of any physical concepts. And here, for the present purposes that you will see on the next slide, it's sufficient to understand conceptual independence in the sense that someone can, some rational person, can believe that something falls under the physical concept without believing it falls under the phenomenal concept. Second is phenomenal essentialism. You already had this on a slide. I'm not going to read it again. And the third is cognitive transparency. If 2 concepts are both nature-revealing concepts of one and the same property, then these 2 concepts are not conceptually independent. And then the premise 4 is a sufficient condition of physicality. If there is a nature-revealing phenomenal concept of a property, and there is no nature-revealing physical concept, not even a possible concept, so to speak, of that property, then that property has a non-physical nature. So the idea is if you can access the nature of a property in that first-personal manner that is involved in phenomenal concepts, and you cannot access that nature in physical terms. And where I understand these physical terms as being terms or concepts that are not subject presupposing. So if you have a concept that is really a physical concept, then certainly it's not conceptually true that only subjects can have that property. That's, for me, a minimal condition for being a physical concept. And it's clear that no physical concept that satisfies that condition can give us access to the nature of experiential properties, right? Because it's in the nature of those properties that there is someone, and so a concept that captures that nature must be subject presupposing. So if we accept these premises, then we come to these conclusions. The first is, from the first 3 premises, that for any pure experiential property, there is a nature-revealing phenomenal concept of that property, but no nature-revealing physical concept of that property. And then, if we accept this sufficient condition for non-physicality, which was expressed in premise 4, we come to the conclusion that any pure experiential property has a non-physical nature. Now, how can a physicalist reply? I think that perhaps the only plausible way is to deny premise 4 and to endorse the idea that some physical properties are very strange properties, namely properties that have a nature that can only be accessed cognitively via phenomenal concepts. In other words, it's a purely phenomenal nature and cannot be captured by any physical concept, and still there are physical properties. Then, well, I'm wondering what makes such a position still a physicalist position. Isn't that giving up the core idea of physicalism to admit the existence of these very extravagant properties? Isn't that really to become a dualist under a false title? So that's what I wanted to say.